does the Bible say about
All right, let's see it.
Genesis 19 records one of the most prolific events in history,
I think you may need to look up how people use the word prolific.
where God himself chose to intervene to rain down fire and brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner in order to eradicate the population to prevent sodomy from spreading.
So there is not a single syllable of the Bible that anywhere represents the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as God's attempt to stop the spread of sodomy, which is nowhere identified as a proximate cause of its destruction. The most explicit identification of the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is identified in Ezekiel 16:49, where the prophet says that the sin of Sodom was pride, an excess of bread, prosperous ease, yet they did not strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. And that is summarized as being haughty and doing abominations before me.
The perversion had aggregated so violently that the Bible says that the men of Sodom, both young and old, sought to rape 2 angels.
So here this creator actually correctly identifies the problem with the behavior of Genesis 19. And that problem is the fact that they're trying to sexually assault male angels. And that's a problem for 3 main reasons. The first has to do with the fact that sexual assault is a gross display of inhospitality. And Genesis 18 and Genesis 19 are painting a contrast between the righteousness and the hospitality of the rural nomadic Abraham over and against the wickedness and the inhospitality of the urban city-dwelling men of Sodom. Now, sexual assault is always about power, and when you sexually assault someone, you are taking away their power. And in addition to being a gross display of inhospitality, it is escalated because these 2 angels are represented as male angels, and so men sit at the top of the social hierarchy of domination and penetration. And so to take away the power of someone at the top of that hierarchy is a more severe violation of their social roles. And even today, there is an escalated dimension of shame and disgrace associated with men being victims of sexual assault, because they're not supposed to be victimized in that way, because they're supposed to be more powerful. And the fact that they are angels is the third problem, because they actually sit a step higher than humans on that social hierarchy of domination and penetration.
Later, when the children of Israel went into the promised land and had a functioning government, God instituted strict laws against sodomy via Leviticus 20:13 in order to prevent the events from Genesis 19 from reoccurring.
So the legislation of Leviticus 18 and 20 has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with trying to prevent the events of Genesis 19 from reoccurring. Both chapters are quite explicit that the goal is to try to prevent the land from kicking the people of Israel out again. So these are post-exilic authorities who have rationalized the exile as the land kicking the people of Israel out because they sinned too much and polluted the land too much, and the land couldn't take it anymore, so they were kicked out. And so now they're coming up with rules and regulations that will hopefully govern the behavior of the house of Israel and prevent them from achieving that critical mass of contamination in the land. The idea was that there were these socially conventionalized boundaries around behavior, and to cross those boundaries generated a kind of metaphysical contamination or pollutant that spilled out onto the land, and if that reached a critical mass, then the land couldn't bear it anymore, and the land kicked the people out. That's pretty explicit within those chapters. Additionally, Leviticus 18 and 20 are 2 different phases of the development of this legislation. In Leviticus 18, the main problem is whoever is taking the insertive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse, and that was absolutely being condemned. This was not about pedophilia. This was not about cultic prostitution. This was a condemnation of a man taking the insertive role in an act of same-sex intercourse, which was considered to victimize whoever took the receptive role. Now, in Leviticus 20, you have a later group of people who are elaborating on the legislation of Leviticus 18, and rather than just render the offender culpable, they are rendering both parties engaged in inappropriate sexual activity culpable, even though the receptive partner, whether male or female, is not an active agent in this activity. They are the victim, but Leviticus 20 is escalating the severity and the culpability and saying both parties are culpable. Both parties bear the guilt of that contamination, that pollution on the land, and so both parties have to be gotten rid of. Additionally, none of these laws were actually operative or enforced anywhere near this time period. It wasn't until the Hellenistic period that the legislation of Deuteronomy, of Leviticus, of Exodus was widely known about and widely enforced. So this creator is wildly misrepresenting both the history of this legislation as well as its purpose.
However, the leniency of the leaders subverting the laws of God caused these crimes against nature to resurface once again in Judges 19.
Same-sex intercourse is something that occurs in nature. It is not a crime against nature in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And the reference to Judges 19 creates more problems for this creator's rhetoric than it solves, because that is a more clear demonstration of the fact that the problem is a display of inhospitality. We've got a very similar story. Somebody from outside is staying the night, is seeking hospitality within this town explicitly because it is supposed to be an Israelite town, and they should be able to find greater hospitality in the town. But the men of the town again threaten sexual assault against the visitor, a gross display of inhospitality. Now in Genesis 19, Lot offers to send out his 2 daughters, which does not ultimately happen. In Judges 19, the man does send out his concubine, and she is ultimately assaulted throughout the night, ultimately resulting in her death. And the man the next morning callously steps over her dying body and barks at her to get up because they got to hurry. And when he understands what has happened, he dismembers her and sends pieces to all of the tribes of Israel, not to show that these men wanted to have same-sex intercourse with me, but to show that the inhospitality, the gross wickedness of Israel had boiled over and had resulted in this crime against what is ultimately his property, but a woman who was sexually assaulted. So what is being identified as the problem is the sexual assault that is a gross display of inhospitality.
Thereafter, revival in the Bible was characterized by the kings removing sodomites out of the land, according to 1 Kings 15, verse 12.
So the relevant word in that passage is kedoshim, which literally means consecrated ones or holy ones, and it's grammatically masculine and is widely understood to refer to cultic sex workers. In other words, men who would be paid in order to take a receptive role in an act of same-sex intercourse. So the word sodomites traditionally refers to the other part, the active role, and there can be a dimension of non-consent in the use of that word. So rendering kedoshim as sodomites is a laughable mistranslation of this passage.
Now, lest you think these are isolated incidents of the Old Testament, the New Testament states in Jude 1:7, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire.
So this is a gross misreading of Jude 1:7. The context here indicates this has something to do with the relationship of angels to humans. And the relevant Greek phrase is sarkos heteros, which means different flesh or other flesh. Heteros is where we get the word hetero from. What does other flesh refer to? Well, it refers to flesh that isn't human. It refers to flesh that is angelic. There had actually been debates around this time period of the sexual compatibility of angels and humans. And this arose in response to the reading of Genesis 6 that is offered by the book of Enoch. It understands the B'nai Elohim, the children of God of Genesis 6, as angels who came down and had offspring with human women. And then some other people said, well, no, angels can't rebel the way the B'nai Elohim are described as rebelling in Genesis 6. And there's also no sexual compatibility between angels and humans. And so another reading developed of Genesis 6 as a reference to humans as the B'nai Elohim, and particularly the line of Seth. And so the idea is that part of the wickedness was these angels seeking sexual relationships with humans. And so Jude 1:7 is escalating the crime of the men of Sodom against these visitors as not only the threat of sexual assault, but again, trying to cross those boundaries that ought not to be crossed. Humans going after the flesh of angels, which was inappropriate. This has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with same-sex intercourse, and this creator is simply misreading a bunch of passages of the Bible